Okay, welcome to this video on the structure of sentences with modifiers. Remember, the modifiers that we're talking about in chapter 10 are the adverbials that we discussed in chapter 7 and the adjectivals that we introduce here in chapter 10. So those are the two kinds of modifiers that we are looking at in chapter 7. Those adverbials were things like adverb phrases, prepositional phrases, noun phrases. The adjectivals that we're looking at in chapter 10 are, of course, adjective phrases, but also we were looking at some adjective clauses and other kinds of phrases. So these were those non-essential elements in a sentence. We talked about grammatical necessity. So these were all of that extra stuff that we talked about in chapter 7 and in the last video for chapter 10, right? So how does that look when we try to diagram a sentence? I want to look at a couple of sentences from the midterm exam. First sentence that you all probably recognize. This was one of the sentences on the midterm exam that I asked you to diagram. And so most of you were able to correctly identify a couple of these phrases. So most of you were able to zoom in on that noun child and recognize that the determiner, the adjective, and the noun all come together to form a noun phrase. And then most of you, not all of you, were able to correctly identify on the plane as a prepositional phrase. We have that preposition on, followed by a noun phrase, the plane. And then I would see certain various forms of some diagram that might look something like this. And so I might get, a noun phrase and the prepositional phrase, and then the rest of the sentence was maybe a single verb phrase or a verb phrase with a noun phrase or a prepositional phrase or an adverb phrase or something, right? There were a variety of things. But I got something, let's just focus on those first two pieces, and they're kind of coming together, right, separately as two separate chunks. But if we looked at it more carefully, we should be able to see that this noun phrase and this prepositional phrase do not belong in two separate chunks. So again, if we want to use one of those structural tests that we talked about in chapter 4, chapter 5, can we substitute this noun phrase with a pronoun, right? Who kicked the back of my seat constantly? Who was that person? Who is the subject of the sentence, right? And we can see that if I take the noun phrase, the subject of the sentence, and replace it with a pronoun, I don't know if this child is a little boy or a little girl, but I can substitute a he or she in there. The he or she would not replace the noun phrase an annoying child. Okay, we don't have a sentence that looks like this. Okay, we're not going to have he on the plane kicked the back of my seat or she on the plane, right? On the plane, that prepositional phrase gets deleted just with the annoying child. The entire phrase, an annoying child on the plane, is replaced with the he or the she, right? It's not going to be he on the plane. It'll be he kicked the back of my seat. She kicked the back of my seat. In the question, who kicked the back of my seat? So when we draw our diagram, we need to visually represent that these pieces are all together in one chunk. So when we have our tree diagram, the annoying child and on the plane need to connect. We need to show that connection where they're together, right? And I think we could even represent this by drawing it a little better. I think a more accurate visual representation of what's going on would show us, right, that the determiner, the adjective phrase, and the noun child fit together with the prepositional phrase, and all together we have a single noun phrase, right? And that single noun phrase is what we would replace with a pronoun like he or she, right? So we see that prepositional phrase is piece of, right? The noun phrase. It all goes together. We have it in one chunk. And the same thing is going to happen with the noun that goes in the verb phrase. I have a noun phrase, the back, and I have a preposition phrase, of my seat. But if we think about it, what did the annoying child kick? Right? He kicked the back of my seat. He kicked it. We can replace that entire phrase with a pronoun. The back of my seat is one chunk. So when we draw a tree diagram, we need to make sure the back of my seat all comes together in one noun phrase. And that might look something like this. So here we have the back of my seat. We see that my seat is a noun phrase. It's the object of the preposition. So it goes inside the preposition phrase. The preposition phrase is attached to the previous noun and determiner. All three of those things are going into one single noun phrase. And then we can see the back of my seat is one chunk of language, right? So when we are trying to draw these out, we're just making a visual representation of the grammatical structure. If we can conceptualize this whole chunk of language as one thing, and we can, right? Because we can replace the whole thing with a pronoun, it. Then when we draw out our diagram, we need to make sure they all come together into one phrase. And that's what we're going to look at with these adverbials and adjectivals. The adjectivals will be attached to a noun because, again, adjectives describe nouns. The adverbials will be attached to some verb, right? Adverbs describe verbs. So when we're drawing these out, if I have an adverbial, you know that that adverbial is going to be inside a verb phrase somehow, right? And that adjectival will be inside of a noun phrase in some form or fashion. It's got to be, right? It's describing the noun. It's got to be inside the noun phrase. If it's describing a verb, it's got to be inside the verb phrase. So let's do a few examples. And when we draw them out, we can see visually how this is happening. So let's look at our first example. Okay. The Simons took a stroll in the park. Now we could just start, go ahead and try to draw this out, right? You could just say, okay, I'm going to first identify the parts of speech. Okay, so we could sit there and list out, right? We know that there's an article, that's a determiner, that's a Simons, it's a last name, that's a proper noun, took is a verb, determiner, preposition, determiner, noun, etc., etc. So we mark all of our adjectives and adverbs and nouns and determiners, and then we stumble around trying to draw lines and make everything match up. But before we start drawing the lines, it's good to sort of have an idea of where we need to end up, right? And that's when we start thinking about those grammatical roles. What's the subject of the sentence, right? The subject is usually a noun phrase. It's the who or what is doing the action. I know, because I'm a native English speaker and I know English, that that's got to be my subject, right? And again, I know that that's one chunk because I can replace it with a pronoun. I can say they took a stroll in the park. So I know that those two words have to come together to make one phrase. And if I ask a question, The question would be, who took a stroll in the park? The fact that I can replace the Simons with a pronoun, right, or a question word, I know that that's one chunk. So when I'm drawing my lines together, those two words have to come together to make one chunk, right? Now, I've got this preposition phrase I see here, right? If I can identify that, anytime I see a preposition followed by a noun phrase, I know that's going to be one chunk. And I can test that, right? If that's really one chunk, right, then I should be able to replace it with a proform. In the park is telling me a location. I can replace that with a locative. There. The Simons took a stroll there. Okay? Or here. The Simons took a stroll here. And if it's a question word, where did the Simons take a stroll? Where? In the park. So in the park can be replaced by locative. In the park can be a question, an answer to a question. Where did they take a stroll? In the park. So I know when I'm drawing my diagram, those three words need to come together eventually as one chunk. I'm going to need to visually represent that as one piece. Okay. The same goes for a stroll, right? A determiner and a noun are going to go together. So I know, right, what did they take? Okay, here's my direct object. They took what? What did they take? A stroll. Or if I was replacing it with a pronoun, I could say they took it. Sounds very odd. We don't usually, phrase it like that, but I mean, they took it. What did they take? They took it. They took a stroll. So I know I need to draw lines where those two pieces come together as one chunk. And what do I do with that took? So now I have the subject of my sentence. The Simons, that's one chunk that I can replace with a subject pronoun. I have the direct object of my sentence, a stroll. That can be replaced by an object pronoun. And then lastly, I have an adverbial. This is a prepositional phrase, right? And it's an adverbial because it's telling me something about the verb. It's giving me the location of this taking a stroll, right? Does that verb took exist separately by itself, right? Well, let's try our, question form. Okay, if I ask the question, who took a stroll in the park? I could answer, the Simons did. That did does not replace the verb took. It replaces the entire phrase took a stroll in the park, right? Similarly, if I ask the question, what did they do? They took a stroll in the park. That do and that did are not only replacing the verb took, it replaces the entire phrase took a stroll in the park. So that tells me that that whole phrase together must be one piece. That will be one verb phrase. So when I'm drawing my tree diagram, all of that needs to somehow eventually connect down into one verb phrase, right? So just like we saw that adjectival, the adjective phrase is connected to the noun phrase. If you have an adverbial, whether it's an adverb phrase, a noun phrase, a verb phrase, or in this case, a prepositional phrase, it needs to be inside the verb phrase because that is, what do we call that? Your predicate, right? The predicate is not just the verb took. The predicate includes everything after the main verb, the direct object, the indirect object, the object complement, the subject complement, any adverbials, right? That predicate is big. it's comprehensive. It includes a lot of stuff. So when we're drawing our tree diagram, we really need to show how all of these things are connected. And it's good if you can identify that ahead of time so you don't get lost in the weeds. So let's see what our tree diagram would look like. So if we looked at the final tree diagram, it would look something like this. And when you're finished drawing your tree diagram, right, you need to ask yourself a few questions. And then if you can visually see the answer to your question, you know you've drawn the tree diagram correctly, okay? So we start with the main sentence. That's that little S down at the bottom. We know that a sentence needs a subject and a predicate. Where's my subject? It should be one piece. It should be represented as one piece. And there we see it, right? It's a noun phrase. Where's my predicate? There we see it, okay? So the subject is usually a noun phrase. The predicate is a verb phrase. There's my subject, there's my predicate. There's my two pieces coming together, all right? Now, inside my predicate, I look at my verb. I should have my main verb. This is a transitive verb. It requires a direct object. Do I have my direct object? Yes. And it's represented as one piece. That's my direct object. Do I have any adverbials that are modifying the verb? Yes. And that in this sentence is a prepositional phrase. Okay. Inside a prepositional phrase, I know I always need an object of the preposition. Where is that? That's represented here in my noun phrase. So I've got all my pieces lined up. So here we have all of our pieces, right? Subject, predicate. Inside the predicate, main verb, direct object, adverbial. In this case, the adverbial is a prepositional phrase. The prepositional phrase, you have a preposition and an object of the preposition. And I can see those pieces all together. Preposition, right? An object of the preposition. Okay, so you can see all of those pieces if you know what you're looking for. Okay, so this is an example of a sentence with an adverbial. And we can see adverbials modify verbs. So the adverbial needs to go inside the verb phrase because it's part of, it's a piece of the predicate. And we can see that visually represented here. Let's check out an example with an adjectival. Okay, so let's try this sentence again, just looking at the big picture. We need a subject and a predicate. And I hope all of you can immediately see the subject of my sentence will be this entire phrase here. Because after that, we've got a verb and we've got an adjective, right? So this whole piece here, right? We know it's a subject because we can replace it with a subject pronoun. It, right? It was pretty fun. If I was asking a question, what was pretty fun? Okay, so that has to be visually represented as one chunk of language when I draw my diagram, okay? And the be verb, right, even more so than some other verbs, it's pretty obvious to see that the adjective, right, needs to be connected to that be verb, right? Those two pieces, they have to go together, right? You can't have a sentence that just says, the casino that I went to in Lake Charles was, period, right? That would be a really odd sentence to say most of the time. You're leaving your listener hanging if you just say was, right? Now, if it's an answer to a question, you could always say like, yeah, it was. right? But somebody's asking you, was it fun? Yeah, it was. Okay. But if I'm not answering a question and I'm just giving a statement, I don't generally use the be verb without something following the be verb. This is be verbs are it's very easy to see that predicate. So there's my subject and predicate, right? Okay, so the first thing we do is we identify all the parts of speech. Okay, first thing that we immediately need to recognize is that word that. The casino that I went to, that is usually a demonstrative, right? That girl, that man, that book over there, I went to that beach over there. I went to that casino. That would be a determinant. Okay. Determiners precede nouns, right? But what comes after this determiner, that? We have an entire phrase. I went to. That's an entire clause. We have a subject and a verb. So we got to immediately recognize this is not a determiner. It's a pronoun. It's called a relative pronoun. Sorry. Okay. It's a relative pronoun. That, which, who, whom, or whose. Okay. Those are your relative pronouns. That we discussed that in another video. Please, if you haven't watched that video on Moodle, check it out. Relative pronouns. Okay. The next thing we see is that Lake Charles. We're not going to treat those as two separate words. That's a proper noun in and of itself. So we can't separate the lake and the Charles. That's one name. That's one noun, proper noun. And that word pretty, sometimes, probably most of the time, pretty is an adjective. She was very pretty, right? Oh, your baby is so pretty. Okay. That would be an adjective. But here, we don't mean the casino was visually appealing, right? Pretty is modifying the word fun. It means it was somewhat fun. Not very fun, not a lot of fun, but somewhat, kind of fun, right? It was just kind of fun. This is a qualifier, okay? Just the same qualifier would be very fun, okay? It was quite fun, okay? It was really fun. Those are qualifiers. And I hope you can see that those two words are going to go together, right? We're going to have those words together. If I can get this working for me, okay? So the qualifier and the adjective together make an adjective phrase, right? Okay. Well, that adjective phrase is following the be verb. And to represent that that's all one piece, we're going to combine the verb with the adjective phrase. That gives us our verb phrase. That is our predicate. So we have visually represented those three words as one chunk, right? The predicate of my sentence. And if you're doing some Googling or going online to watch grammar videos, you'll see that adjective phrase referred to as a predicate adjective. Okay. So now that's one piece of our sentence. The entire rest of it is going to be the subject of my sentence. So all of that we need to eventually get down into a noun phrase, right? Into one chunk. So let's start breaking that up. So your first instinct might to go directly to the casino and say, well, I've got a determiner, I've got a noun. So the casino makes a noun phrase. But let's do our test, right? A noun phrase can be replaced by a pronoun. So what happens if I replace this noun phrase with a pronoun? In this case, my pronoun would be it, right? The casino, it. It that I went to in Lake Charles was pretty fun. I don't know about you, but I don't like that sentence at all, right? So because we cannot replace the casino with a pronoun, it, we know that those two words, the and casino, need to be combined with something else. And in fact, we'll see that that entire phrase, the casino that I went to in Lake Charles can be replaced by it, right? It was pretty fun, right? That, again, using what we know from our grammatical rules, we know this whole thing is our subject. The whole thing can be replaced by a pronoun. So the whole thing together needs to come down and combine into a noun phrase. So we'll start with Lake Charles. We said it was a proper noun. It exists alone by itself, nothing else with it. It's a noun phrase, right? It's following a preposition in Lake Charles. So that's going to be my prepositional phrase. We have a preposition and an object of a preposition. Okay. Now, what do we do with the verb? Well, I know I've got a verb, went. It's being followed by a preposition. Here we have an interesting situation where the preposition is not followed by an object, right? Because where did I went to where? Where did I go? I went to the casino, right? So the casino is not immediately following this preposition because we have this adjective clause. So the preposition is kind of floating out on its own, right? I did what? What did I do? I went to the casino in Lake Charles. We're just going to put went and to, and we're going to put our prepositional phrase all together into a verb phrase. The noun, the noun phrase, what went? Who went, right? I did. So if we put it all together, right, I can't connect the noun phrase I with the verb phrase went to in Lake Charles and just connect those together as one piece, because I went to in Lake Charles, if we just kind of took that out and looked at it by itself, so we kind of just removed it from the sentence, I hope you can see, you can feel in your gut, that is not a complete chunk in and of itself, right? It's missing. It's missing the object. Where did I go? I went where? I went to what? Right? It's so this is not one piece that can stand on its own, right? It needs to be connected with that relative pronoun. So the whole clause itself, if we look at this chunk that I went to in New Orleans, that feels like a more proper chunk that I can then attach to something else, right? Which casino? The one that I went to in Lake Charles. Okay. Wait, what did you say? Which casino? That I went to in Lake Charles. Okay. The restaurant that I went to in Lake Charles. The hotel that I went to in Lake Charles. The museum that I went to in Lake Charles. This really feels feels like one piece, right? But of course, it's an adjectival. It's describing something. So I need to connect it to the noun that it's describing. So we get down to our final piece of the puzzle where we connect the determiner, noun, and relative clause. The casino that I went to in Lake Charles. All of those come together into one noun phrase, which is the subject of my sentence. And now I hope that you can see visually how the subject of the sentence is incorporating the whole piece. The determiner, the noun, the relative clause. And the predicate of the sentence is combining everything that comes after the main verb, and in this case, an adjective phrase. Okay? If you can see these pieces in your mind, the subject, the direct object, the predicate, right? The complement, okay? Whatever pieces we're putting together, a relative clause. Is it an adjectival? Is it describing something? If it's describing the subject, it needs to all go together into one noun phrase. If it's an adverbial, and it's describing the verb, that adverbial and the main verb need to all be together as one predicate into one verb phrase. Okay? I hope this was helpful. I'll post some more information on Moodle where you can practice for yourself.